Did I catch that correctly? It's Dr. Scherer? All right. Is your microphone on? Is the green light on there?
No, it's on.
That okay. Sounds better. Dr. Scherer, were you in the room this morning when I went through the penalties for perjury?
Yes, I was.
And do you understand what perjury is?
Yes.
Being advised of the potential penalties for perjury, do you promise to tell the truth in this case today?
I do.
All right. Can I have you start by stating your full name and spelling your last name for the record?
I'm Thomas F. Scherer. My last name is spelled Scherer.
All right. Thank you. And Mr. Pelham,
we offer as commission exhibits documentation prepared by Mr. Scherer, or Dr. Scherer rather.
Can I label it as like PSC 1?
That would be great.
Okay. Any objection to the exhibit, Mr. Bender?
No objection, Your Honor.
Sorry. And Mr. Jordy, any objection?
No objection.
All right, PSC 1 is admitted. And Mr. Shook, you're asking the questions, so go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, Mr. Scherer, can you just give us a little kind of brief background of your education experience?
I certainly can. I got my BS, MS, and PhD from the University of Minnesota. Probably relevant to this is my senior design project as an undergraduate was a tile drainage project. But in terms of North Dakota drainage, I've been here since 1991. And as you all know, our wet season started, or wet cycle, I should say, started in 1993. By about 1995, I started at the request of county agents and crop improvement associations. I started doing presentations about tile drainage because they were requesting it. And I work for NDSU Extension, and we are in education. So if people ask questions, if they want the technical details, we provide it to them. We don't make the decision for them about whether they put in tile or not. That's up to them. But if somebody wants the information, the technical information, I want to give it to them so they make the right decision. So the questions started increasing a lot. So in 1999, I joined together with my colleagues at the University of Minnesota, and we started doing tile drainage design workshops. They were 2-day workshops. And I think the first one we did, we had 45 people there from both Minnesota and North Dakota. And then after that, it kept increasing. We've done them annually up until a couple of years ago. At that time, there was only one tile contractor in the Red River Valley, and they are located in Brooks, Minnesota. And I think Ellingson's moved here in 2000, and then a lot of other contractors started coming up. So we've been doing these workshops. We estimate that over the years, we've probably trained over 2,500 people in the fundamentals of tile drainage. Most of our clients have been the public and farmers and government agency people. We're not trying to make them installers. What we're trying to do is introduce them to how you design a tile system so that when they do talk to a contractor like Ellingson, they know what these terms mean. So that's been my background. In addition to the teaching some of the technical details, where to find out information about how to apply them to individual fields. We've also given, my colleague Dr. Hans Cannell and I have given many presentations to different groups that lasted for an hour or more, to some of the water resource districts, to the soil conservation districts and places like that. If we don't get into design, we get into the fundamentals of tile. In addition, I've been involved with quite a few research projects. One of them just 10 miles south of here. We were working with a farmer down there by Fairmont for over 10 years on their field. Some on the Minnesota side, all up and down the valley. Primarily what we're looking at is the impact of tile on salinity, which has not been mentioned here today. I had a 5-year project where we were looking at the water quality coming out of tile. We had 8 sites stretching from this county all the way up to Walsh County. We collected samples for 4 years. For one summer, we did a recon, and then for 4 years, we collected whenever the tile were running and analyzed them. And in our State Department of Environmental Quality did the analysis of the water. We didn't do that. So we got all that background. We're trying to look at what the impacts of salt. And one of the things I would mention here is that when you remove this soil from the Red River Valley, as you go deeper, the salts increase significantly. So the contractors have to be extremely cognizant that they keep the topsoil separate from the bottom soil, because if you put that bottom soil back on top, it will affect yields. We know that specifically. And it takes a while to recover that ability to get to full. But I don't have the data in the Red River Valley, but colleagues out by Williston have been looking at the impact of those pipelines in the oil country. And they're looking at pasture grasses and things like that. And their estimate is that after construction, it sometimes takes 4 to 5 years to get back to normal production. So I would bring that up for the commission to consider that. I don't know where you would fit that in, but as a neutral party, that is something that we've observed. And I don't know if these in the pipeline, I don't know anything about the construction or the materials they're selecting, but as they put it in, these are high water table areas where you're going to find this tile. So it's going to be covered in water periodically. It's been our observation that we go through seasonal high water table. This time of year, in the next few weeks, we'll see it rise. There's no doubt about it. Our tile systems run primarily beginning after the melt, after the frost goes out of the ground, up until the middle of June, and then it drops. And if we get a wet fall like in 2019, then we'll see it run again. We rarely ever see it run in the summertime, in July and August and early September. So that's what happens in this area. I think any of the tile contractors can probably tell you the same thing.
Okay. So I think it's safe to say you've been working with drain tile or talking about drain tile since the early to mid-90s?
That's correct.
And consistently, you still do this today?
Yes, we do. In fact, I've just been on a couple of farm visits regarding this a little farther west, up Logan County.
Sure. So in that time, have you been around anywhere where they've cut or damaged drain tile and had to do any repairs to it?
Yeah, I can give you. Just last summer, one of our grad students was putting in a project and managed to go out in the field and punch a hole on a tile system 50 feet apart with a 4-inch tile, and they managed to hit it dead center. So we had to go out there and we dug it up, found it, and repaired it ourselves. But it's a common practice in installations. Sometimes tile gets stretched or it gets broken, and you talk to the contractors just like this morning. It's common to repair them, but usually not over 50, 60, 70, 80 feet. It's usually a small break that they're repairing.
So maybe just like an individual puncture that you used to see in versus because I think what we're likely to see with a pipeline like this going through, kind of laterally intersecting it, 50 to 100 feet is most likely to just be sheared off, and then, as Ellingson was discussing, just entirely replaced in that area with a different type, but I think they were claiming would be compatible.
Yeah, in the floods of 2009, right out by the Harrelson ethanol plant, we had a project out there where we were sampling it. And the flooding was so bad it came over the road and it actually exposed a bunch of the tile. So they basically came in and just did new stuff over the top. But yeah, those kind of problems happen in various. There's been cases where we've had more in the southern part, down towards Oaks. You can have iron ochre problems, which is an iron bacteria that gets in and plugs up the tile. And I know that stretches of that have been replaced. But it's not like you're digging a hole underneath it. What you're doing is just exposing it, taking it out, putting in new pieces. So you still have that support underneath to hold the tile properly at the grade and elevation that it needs to be.
Sure. So the base underneath the tile is important to the.
Absolutely. You look at closely at most tile plows, they have a rounded bottom, so that the rounded tile sits on that for support. Okay. And you don't want a flat bottom, because it depends on how they backfill it. You can start to squash it. Several years ago, I worked with a farmer on the Minnesota side, where he had one field that had been installed in December, and it was cold, and whoever put it in didn't backfill properly. So what happened is he ended up with a bunch of squashed tile from these. You ever watch them when they plow it in? Sometimes you get pet-ons or soil chunks this big around. And if they're frozen and you push them back into the trench, it'll squash. And the way we knew is that I looked at hundreds of feet of video that they'd run up there, and they were looking at the laterals, and they were looking. There's one part, there were 3 submains, 8 inches diameter, all squashed flat. So that tile system was not working properly. So it has to do, we always talk about it in the workshops, 50%, you spend most of your time planning it, and then you install it, but you got to install it right. And the installation is the key to making these things last for 100 to 150 years.
Sure. I guess I had assumed they would install it with one of the plow type of systems where they're just kind of burying a plow into the ground, unspooling the drain tile as they're the same. Yeah, one fatal swoop instead of digging a trench, putting the tile in and backfilling. I didn't realize that was one of the ways that it was installed.
Most of the crushed laterals is where they came into the main. Okay. And they do have to open up, depending on the size of the main, you can plow them in. In some cases, when they're large, you have what they call single wall tile, and you have dual wall. Sometimes at that time, the dual wall is very stiff. It comes in pieces. Sometimes 10 feet, some 20. So you got to open up a trench to install them. That's where most of the damage took place. It's in those, not out in the field, because a tile plow just cuts a furrow and installs the tile behind it, as you mentioned.
Sure. So more so like when they were talking about the headers or the main lines is where we see the more trench situation.
Right.
Okay. So if pipeline was to come along where there's already an existing tile system, would the repair of that tile system, in your opinion, impact its performance of the tile system?
As long as you bedded it properly and you replace it with and you support it and keep it on the grade it's meant to be, it shouldn't impact its performance. The biggest problem that we have is, contrary to popular belief, clay is not a problem in tile. It's fine sand, and that will migrate in with water movement. And if you got any dips in the line, that's where it'll congregate. It'll take time, but eventually it may plug it up. So I think research done in Ontario and Ohio indicated that you can't be perfect installing these things with this plow. So they allow a certain up and down movement. It's usually equal to about half or a little more of the diameter of the tile, that you can tolerate this variation.
So how about, as Mr. Ellingson this morning described how their plan for repairing the tile along this project, does that sound like a sufficient way to ensure that the system continues to function long term?
As far as I can tell, if you're using a metal support for the tile as it goes across, I don't see any problem. The main concern I had is if you just replaced it with an similar piece of tile, you would have to compact that support underneath it, wherever those tile lines went across, to about the same bulk density it was before. And that could be a lot of work. So using an external support is a good idea.
I think he's talking about sandbags.
So. That's to, the support. Well, think about it. You could have a 50, 60, 70 foot length of metal pipe. There's going to be some bend there, so supporting it in the middle is probably going to, if they backfill it properly after the soil settles after a couple of years, it'll probably be just fine.
So I think we started touching on this with another witness earlier. So if you were to want to put drain tile in a field that already has a pipeline installed, do you think that would impact the cost of the system?
As we say in the workshop, there's no one right way to tile a field. But when you sit down and you work out different scenarios, you always end up with about the same amount, same lineal feet of once you determine the spacing and so forth, you always end up with about the same lineal feet of tile, no matter which way you design. So putting a header in there probably might add some cost to the, if you had to go around it and design around the pipeline. But it's not going to, it's $1,200 or $1,000 an acre. It's not going to add that much more cost to the system in terms of the material. Where a lot of the cost is actually making the connections. Because you got to dig down and physically make the connections to these headers. That will add to the cost. Now, it all depends on the equipment that the installer has and so forth.
Sure. So I think it would likely impact the cost, but maybe not significantly when considered with the cost of the whole system. Is that what you're?
Yeah, if you look at the cost of a quarter section, it may add to it. He's trying to design around them. If you can go over the top of them, it may not change it at all. It all depends on how deep the pipeline is.
Sure.
The one concern, though, that I had was many of the mains and sub-mains are anywhere from 5 to 8 feet deep. If they have to cross through there, how are they going to handle that? I mean, if you got a 12 or 15-inch main, is at the same depth that you're trying to put this pipeline. You either go under or I don't know how you handle that. That's up to the contractors to figure that out.
Sure. Okay. I don't think I have any other questions for you, but thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
Mr. Wahlberg, any questions?
I don't. Thanks, Dr. Scherer.
Mr. Jordy?
I have a few questions. Doctor, were you here this morning to hear the testimony of the Ellingson gentleman?
Yes, I was.
And could you hear all of the questions and answers?
Yes.
And when he was speaking, at least from my perspective, it made it seem like there really isn't ever a problem. In your experience, you've talked about a few concerns. Can you think of any other types of concerns when repairing tile lines or connecting the plastic to clay existing lines, or just different best practices that the commission should be aware of?
No, like I said, repair of tile lines is pretty common. In fact, the manufacturers make a special insert that you put in both sides, and then you got tile tape that you would tape them. for laterals, and the same with connectors for the other ones. That's pretty well established in the industry. So making the connections, I think, as I pointed out, a bigger concern is that you don't get these lower soils from the valley down around 3, 4, 5 feet mixed in with the topsoil.
And so you're talking about the importance of screening the topsoil and avoiding soil mixture because that would reduce yields.
It could. But I think standard practice is to take the topsoil off, put it on one side, and take the bottom soil off on the other. I think the mining industry does this all the time. And just make sure that you put it back the same way.
Sure. And that answer is kind of along the same of an answer you gave to the question of, could this impact performance? And your answer was essentially, if they do everything right, there shouldn't be a problem. Is that fair?
That's correct.
All right. And you would agree that that's pretty much true of almost anything. As long as we do everything 100% right every step of the way, there shouldn't be an issue.
Installation of tile is if it's performed, the design is the layout, but the actual installation is where you make the right connections at the corners, and you keep the right grade and everything. If the installation is done right, then the system will last for a long, long time. We've got a lot of documented evidence of that. We also have documented evidence of poor installations.
Certainly. And in terms of if I owned a farm, let's say a 24-inch pipeline were to come through it, regardless of what it's shipping, and then I wanted to go ahead and place a tile system across that quarter section, let's say, are you familiar with the new difficulties or limitations or increased costs now that we're trying to work around an existing, say, 24-inch pipeline?
I think it would depend on how deep that pipeline is. A lot of the tile in the Red River Valley is only 3 to 3.5 feet below the surface, the laterals. Some mains that everything's got to drain to them, so they're always deeper. The water's got to go somewhere, right? And it's got to go to an outlet. So I'm not sure if I can give you a definitive answer on that.
Would you, if you were designing it, would you prefer that the tiling system go above or below the pipeline, the CO2 pipeline?
I don't know if there's an answer to that. It all depends on what part of the field you're talking about, and what are you talking about, the mains, or are you talking about the lateral?
Well, what I'm trying to get at, sir, is just to give us some education, because you clearly are an expert on the factors that factor in. I realize no specific field is identical to the next, but what we're trying to figure out here are the best practices and the things we need to be concerned about.
If I knew there was a 24-inch pipeline out there, I would and had it marked by the location services, I would try to design around it using headers and not bother to try to mess around going over the top. We've had some spectacular, there was just a case down in Iowa a few years ago where a tile contractor hit a natural gas line with the tile plow and blew it all up and burned it all up. Created a crater over 200 feet long, 50 feet wide when it blew. So you can't always be certain that the depth they give you is exactly the depth that you're going to find it at. A colleague of mine in Manitoba told me about a situation where a farmer went over a similar type of thing. He missed that natural gas pipeline by about that much. He didn't realize until afterwards. So a 24-inch pipeline, I think I would design around it.
And a tile plow, would you agree that those can plow to depths of 7 foot?
If you got the power, most farm plows can't go that deep unless they're That's why they got 600 horsepower engines on those plows. They can go down to 7 feet. And that's what I mean. You can plow in like an 8-inch main with the tile plow.
Okay.
But when you get about that, then it starts to get a little more difficult.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Commissioner Chrisman?
Most of my questions have already been asked, but were you here this morning when Mr. Ellingson talked about the very significant amount of the Red River Valley tiling work that his company does?
Yes.
And being so familiar with the tiling work that's done in the valley, did that surprise you?
No. You know, the National Fish and Wildlife had a database tracking the permits, tile permits. But at the time they put that together, the state law was that if you tile less than 80 acres of impacted area, you didn't have to get a permit. So none of them were put in there. And so it's been an ongoing big-time activity for quite a while. A lot of farmers have put in their own. They got their own plows. They put in the tile. And they may only tile 40 acres at a crack. So they, I think, if you're familiar with the legislature, they changed the law here a couple of years ago so that I think it's going to be amended this year, but anything over, if you tile anything between 15 and 80 acres, you have to let the local water resources board know.
But you're very familiar with the Ellingson Company. They're a substantial presence in the valley with this business, correct?
Yes, I have. I've, like most contractors in the valley, I've sometimes helped them with some technical problems that they've run into off and on.
And so among the larger contractors, is there any disproportionate amount of complaints or anything about Ellingson, or are people generally seem pleased with their work?
Generally pleased, yeah, but I don't track. I don't keep a log of complaints. I've had people come in and visit with me comparing 2 different designs and asking questions in that regard. But
not aware of any disproportionate troubles or anything like that.
Not that I would say. Every business has some complainers, no doubt about it, but not that it's disproportionate, no.
And then you had talked about when you're initially putting in the tiling that it's kind of a rounded pitch so that the lateral will set down nicely in that cup. I guess I had always grown, I thought they were V-shaped, but it doesn't lay on a flat surface, correct?
Right. Some, I should have said, some are slightly V-shaped, some are rounded, so to accommodate the curvature of the tile so that it doesn't get squashed, you know.
And so in this case, when something comes through and disrupts those, presumably cut it and put the hydrocarbon pipeline in and do some backfilling to get to the right level, and you're going to be flat. And Mr. Ellingson's description of that heavier line with it, and that put inside of the metal culvert, you think that will satisfactorily support that so that it doesn't sink and cause a dip?
At first glance, I would say yes. I don't know what the thickness of the metal. I'd have to have more specifics about what the metal corrugated pipeline they're using to insert the tile in. But that would provide that you wouldn't have direct soil contact to that stretch. So you wouldn't have all that overburden laying on top of it. So the metal would take care of that problem. That's how they go about doing it.
I don't have any other questions, but I just do want to say this, Dr. Scherer. I sure do appreciate you and the Extension Service making yourself available to us so that we can get some information from a neutral party that brings such extensive expertise as you do. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Haugenhofer, thank you. I thought Randy was going to say his support for you from being from NDSU. Just to go off of what Commissioner Chrisman was talking about, you talked about that dip, and you testified earlier when Mr. Shook asked you about, you would support that metal support, so you don't have that dip. Have you ever seen, like, if a pipeline comes in, and this is just me growing up where I did, any of the tile heaving, a heaving motion of the tile versus a sinking in? And if so, what would cause that?
That question comes up all the time. Do you get frost heave on tile lines? And as far as we know, that does not happen. If the tile is doing its job right, it's removing all the water around it, the excess water. So you don't get that expansion and contraction that would cause that heave. But if you with almost anytime you dig a ditch, and you're going to get some slumping in it. So if you just put the tile through that, over time the soil would settle with rain and so forth. So that's what I was concerned about, is that when you go across where they dig the pipeline in, that if you don't you don't compact it to support the line properly, equivalent to what the existing soil is, and you could have some slumping in the future. So that metal support is gonna reduce it.
So, for my understanding, anytime you disturb that, your suggestion is to put in a metal support to help prevent any of that.
That was my understanding, is that was the plan that they were going to use for this whenever they crossed the field with tile line.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Mr. Dawson?
Judge Hogan, does the depth of the tile, is that dependent any way on the highest water table mark? So is the depth specific to the tile based upon the water table?
Absolutely. Yeah, if the water table only comes up to 5 feet from the surface, it doesn't do any good to put tile in. The only way tile flows is the water table has to come up and intersect it and flows in. Research has shown that over 70% of the water entering the tile comes in from the lower half. So we've had people put in tile that didn't need it because their water table never got high enough. But they kind of joined the bandwagon, you might say, because the neighbors are doing it. So you definitely have to. I keep asking people when you really have a high water table problem, and most of my questions have been coming farther west, over in the Beach Ridge and what looks like a water table problem may not necessarily be. You have to really have evidence of that. That's why whenever I get calls from that, I grill the people pretty heavily, because it doesn't do any good to put tile in some place where the water never will get to it. So the elevation has to be there for the tile to work.
And so the goal is to dry out the top layer of soil to what level? It's optimum.
From soil science point of view, we'll start with, if you take a soil column, it's made up, it's got a lot of pores and minerals and roots and everything else, but you can saturate it. In other words, you can fill all the open space with water. When you drain it, depending on the pore size, like clay and all that, you only drain out the amount that the gravity will actually pull out of the water. So what's left is what we call plant available water. So you're draining out this excess and not the water that plants use.
that's dependent on every field? I mean, it's field dependent, soil dependent. It's not, there's not, you put it, the best depth to put in drain tile is 10 inches deep. There's no rule like that, or rule of thumb.
Yes, there is, because the manufacturers want at least 2 feet of overburden over the top of the tile if you're on a farm field, because you're going to drive over with a tractor. So that's usually about the minimum they want, overburden. They would prefer 3. But it all has to do with farming operations with equipment and the compaction of the soil, or the forces of the soil due to the implements more than anything.
Thank you. No further questions.
You're welcome.
Mr. Pelham or Mr. Shook, any redirect?
Mr. Mullenberg, any further questions?
No, thank you.
Mr. Jordy?
I have one. Doctor, in terms of ground shifting or settling after you refill a trench, you do the trench, you refill it, and ground can shift and settle. What again are the best practices to minimize that, other than do a good job? I appreciate that, but the actual practices, and to the point of for instance, if there were conditions and this was approved, what should we be expecting of the tile contractor?
I would defer. I don't put in pipelines. I'm not an installer, so I would assume that they have practices that they use when they put in these pipelines for bedding the pipe and refilling them. From my perspective, the biggest thing I have is, as mentioned a couple of times, is the salinity issue and the poor soils that are down below and not mixing them together at the surface.
And then also supporting the tile line itself with some type of structure.
That's correct.
Okay. And do you have a preference or a best practice on what should be used?
I've never had the opportunity to have to do that, so
have you have the opportunity to observe what you believe worked maybe better than other practices?
No, this is relatively new to me.
Okay.
We haven't run into this before.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Nothing further.
Are there any other commissioner questions? All right. Thank you.